What's going on, everyone? In this video, we're going to be going over the assembly and installation of the suspension included with the Vanquish VS4-10 Origin Kit. This will take you from page 12 to page 18 of the included manual. Bag E1 contains the incision shocks and shock parts for this vehicle. Loosen the shock cap on the shocks and remove the shock cap and inner bladder from the assembled shocks. To provide proper dampening, we'll need to add shock oil to the shocks. Shock oil is not provided in the kit. I will be using Team Losey's 45 weight shock oil in these shocks. With the lower shock shaft fully extended, fill the shock shaft until you're around 5 to 8 millimeters from the top of the body. Cycle the shock shaft to get any air out of the shocks that you can. With the shocks filled, we can replace the bladder in the top of the shock, and then we can tighten the cap back in place. You want to make sure that you can fully cycle the shock shaft without it getting too stiff towards the bottom. All 4 of the shocks in this kit come with the red soft incision springs, so it doesn't matter what location you install any of the 4 shocks into. Next, we need to open bag F1 and F2. The links in the VS4-10 are made from stainless steel. They come unassembled like you see here, with the 4mm threads exposed on each end. You'll find the rod ends on the rod end trees. Remove the rod ends from the tree. To assemble the rod ends, you'll need to insert the stainless pivot ball into the plastic rod end and press it into place. You can use a set of needle nose pliers or a set of shock pliers. Once you have your rod ends assembled, you can begin to hand thread them onto the link. With the rod ends started on each side, you can insert an Allen tool into the end of the link to hold it in place. With wrenches installed on each side, you can just begin to rotate the wrenches on each side to tighten down those rod ends. The tie rod is the only link on the VS4-10 that has a bend to it. You want to make sure that the flat portion of the rod end is in the same plane as both of the bends on the tie rod. Once you have all 10 links assembled, we can now begin to attach them to the chassis. In bag F2 with the links, you will find these slider support pieces. These need to be installed along with some of the upper link hardware. But for this step, we're going to install this piece on its own since there is no upper link on the driver's side. An M3x20 screw is used to attach this to the chassis. Moving to the passenger side next, we need to insert the upper link into the skid plate and then attach another slider support with another M3x20 screw in through the skid plate. You can see the passenger side upper link mount attached to the skid plate there. With the chassis flipped over, we can now insert the front lower links and attach them to the chassis. The lower links are attached to the skid plate with M3x16 screws. Using another M3x16, we can attach the panhard to the panhard mount on the chassis side. Next, we need to locate the front axle housing, the tie rod, and drag link. In the bag with the links, you'll also find a bag that includes 2 spacers. In the following steps, there's hardware of 4 different sizes. Now it's easy to spot the 16mm and 30mm length screws. However, there is 20mm and 22mm in the following steps as well. Now there's only 2 22mm screws, and I think it's important to go through and find those early and separate those from the other screws. We're going to begin by attaching the tie rod to the axle. Now this is one of the steps where we need one of those 22mm long screws that we set aside earlier. We're going to take that 22mm screw and put it in through the high steer arm first, and then slide the spacer in next. With a small amount of thread lock on the screw, slide it through the high steer arm, the spacer, the pivot ball, and then thread it into the knuckle. Next, we'll need our drag link. The drag link first goes into position. First, let's apply a small amount of thread lock to our other 22mm screw. Then we're going to put our drag link into position, slide the screw into place. Then we need to insert the thin spacer, and lastly, we need to put our tie rod into place. It may take a little bit of patience to get all 3 of these items into position. Next, we need to install the incision shocks onto the axle. The spring cups on the bottom side of the shock do have a clamping feature with the screw installed. I'm going to try and pay attention to install that clamping feature towards the center of the truck on both the front axle and rear axle. The M3x16 also requires a lock nut on the back side to hold it in position. To install the axle into the chassis, I find that it's easiest to turn the chassis upside down. I'm going to start with the raised upper link on the passenger side. This will again use an M3x16 and a lock nut. Now, before attaching the lower links to the axle, we need to install the drive shaft. But when installing the drive shafts, it's important to note that you should line up the ears on the drive shaft with the ears on the receiving side. This is called installing your drive shaft in phase. Making sure to pay attention to this small detail will help keep vibration out of your drivetrain. With the male and female drive shaft engaged, now you can install your lower link. When installing the lower link on the driver's side, you will need to use a small amount of Loctite on the M3x16 screw because this one threads into that offset differential housing. Being that this one threads into the differential housing, make sure not to over tighten. Now locate one of the shorter M3x12 screws to attach the panhard to the axle. Make sure to use a small amount of thread lock on this piece of hardware. Locate the other M3x12 and use it to attach the drag link to the servo horn. Next, you'll need to open the shock parts bag, and in this bag you'll need to locate this parts tree. You need to remove these two upper shock mount pivots. Place one of the pivots in the upper shock mounting eye of the scale shocks, then move them into position on the shock towers, and lastly attach the shocks to the chassis with the M3x20 hardware. Repeat that on the passenger side, and that will complete the front suspension of the VS4-10. Now moving on to the rear suspension, we need again to locate the slider supports and install them with the M3x20 screws and the upper links. After attaching both upper links and both slider mounts, we can now move on to the rear lower links. These get attached with the M3x16s. Before installing the rear axle into the chassis, we again will attach the scale shocks. With the shocks attached to the rear axle, we can now install it into the chassis. First, we'll install the rear upper links with the M3x30 hardware. And now, before installing the lower links, we need to attach the drive shaft. Again, pay attention to the orientation of the ears of the drive shaft to install the two halves in phase, and then move the lower links into place. And the last step to the suspension is installing the rear shocks into the shock towers. You again will need to locate the two upper shock pivot balls from the plastic parts tree. And that completes the entire VS4-10 suspension.